They left her with 10 rounds and a knife. It was their final mistake. The autumn wind cut through the Montana wilderness like a blade made of ice. And Ji-yeon Park pulled her jacket tighter as she walked along the narrow trail that wound through the pine forest. She had come here alone, as she always did when the memories became too heavy to carry. The mountains never judged her, and the silence never asked questions she could not answer at 34 years old. She had built a life teaching others how to survive in places like this, how to read the land and respect its dangers, how to stay alive when everything worked against them. But today, she was not a teacher today. She was just a woman seeking peace in a world that had given her very little of it. The snap of a branch made her stop. Ji-yeon trusted her instincts the way most people trusted their eyes. And right now, every nerve in her body screamed that something was wrong. She turned slowly, scanning the tree line with the careful attention of someone who had spent years learning to see what others missed. 4 men emerged from the shadows between the pines. They wore hunting gear and carried rifles, but their eyes held something darker than the look of ordinary hunters. The tallest one stepped forward with a smile that made her skin crawl. "Well now," he said in a voice rough as gravel. "Looks like we found ourselves a lost little tourist." Ji-yeon did not run. Running would only excite them, and she needed information before she made any move. "I am not lost," she said calmly. "I know exactly where I am." The man laughed, and the others joined him like wolves finding amusement in cornered prey. "That's so? Then you know nobody can hear you scream out here for about 50 miles in any direction." His name was Marcus Halle. Though she would not learn this until later, he was the leader of this group. A man with a criminal record longer than the mountain trails and a soul blacker than the deepest cave. Before Ji-yeon could react, one of the men behind her moved with surprising speed. She felt a sharp pain in her neck, and the world began to blur and spin. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was Marcus Hale's smile growing wider when Ji-yeon opened her eyes. She found herself in a wooden cabin that smelled of smoke and old blood. Her hands were bound behind her back, and her head throbbed with a pain that pulsed behind her eyes like a second heartbeat. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to push down the panic that threatened to rise in her chest. Panic killed faster than any predator. She had learned that lesson in places far more dangerous than this. The door opened, and Marcus Halle walked in with 2 of his men following close behind. He pulled a wooden chair across the floor and sat down in front of her, studying her face with cold amusement. "You are awake," he said. "Good. I hate it when they sleep through the explanation." Ji-yeon met his eyes without flinching, and something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or the first small seed of doubt. "What do you want?" she asked. Marcus leaned back in his chair and spread his hands wide like a man about to share a wonderful secret. "We run a special kind of business out here," he explained. "Very exclusive, very profitable. And our clients pay good money for a hunting experience they cannot get anywhere else." The words took a moment to sink in, and when they did, Ji-yeon felt ice spread through her veins. "You hunt people," she said. Was not a question. Marcus grinned and clapped his hands together once. "Smart girl." "Yes, we hunt people, and our next client arrives tomorrow morning, which means you have about 12 hours to make this interesting." He stood up and walked to a table in the corner of the room. When he returned, he held an old revolver and a hunting knife. He dropped them both on the floor in front of her. 10 rounds, he said. "And 1 knife. That is more than we usually give. But something about you makes me think you might actually provide some entertainment." His men laughed again, that horrible sound that echoed off the cabin walls. "We will release you at dawn," Marcus continued. "You get a 2-hour head start before we come after you. And let me be clear about something. Nobody has ever survived this game. Not once in 5 years." Ji-yeon looked at the weapons on the floor, then back at Marcus. And if I refuse to play? His smile vanished like smoke in the wind. Then we skipped straight to the ending. And trust me, you want those 2 hours. They cut her bonds and shoved her into a small room with a locked door, and Novindoff Shion sat in the darkness and let her mind work through everything she had seen and heard. 4 men that she knew of. Maybe Moria cabin deep in the wilderness with no visible roads. Nearby a criminal operation that had been running for years without being caught, and they had given her 10 rounds and a knife. The fools actually believed. They were being generous. They saw a woman alone in the mountains and assumed she was helpless. A tourist who had wandered too far from safety. They did not see the years of military training written in the way she held herself. They did not notice how her eyes had mapped every exit, every weapon, every weakness in their setup. They did not understand that they had just handed a combat medic and survival expert exactly what she needed to destroy Themji closed her eyes and began to plan. She thought about the terrain she had walked through, the ravines and caves and deadfall areas that could be turned into traps. She thought about the weather changing, the smell of snow on the wind that promised a storm within days. She thought about every lesson she had ever learned, every technique she had ever taught, every night she had spent alone in the wilderness, learning its secrets. When the door opened at dawn and rough hands pushed her out into the cold morning air, Ji-Yeon did not stumble. She walked to the tree line with the revolver tucked into her belt and the knife strapped to her thigh. And she did not look back at the men who watched her go. Marcus called out after her, his voice carrying through the still morning air. "Run fast, little tourist. The clock is ticking." Ji-Yeon stepped into the forest and disappeared among the trees. But she did not run instead. She walked calmly into the shadows, her mind already working through what needed to happen. Next, they thought they were the hunters and she was the prey. They thought 10 rounds and a knife were tools of desperation for a doomed woman. They thought this would be over by noon. They were wrong about everything, and by the time they realized their mistake, it would be far too late to save themselves. They left her with 10 rounds and a knife. It was their final mistake. Ji-Yeon moved through the forest like water flowing around stones. Silent and patient and completely in control, most people in her situation would have run as fast as they could toward civilization, burning energy and leaving obvious trails for their hunters to follow. But Ji-Yeon was not most people. She had spent 8 years in the army, 4 of them as a combat medic deployed to some of the harshest terrain on Earth. She had learned to survive in deserts and jungles and frozen mountain passes where the wrong step meant death. These men with their rifles and their cruel smiles had no idea what they had unleashed. Instead of fleeing, she circled back toward the cabin, moving in a wide arc that kept her hidden among the thick undergrowth. She needed information before she could make any real plans. How many men were there exactly? What weapons did they have? What were their patterns and weaknesses? The sun climbed higher in the sky as she found a position overlooking the cabin from a rocky outcrop about 300 meters away. She lay flat against the cold stone and watched over the next several hours. She counted 4 men total. Marcus was clearly the leader, giving orders and checking his watch with growing impatience. 2 brothers served as trackers. She could tell they were related by their similar builds and the way they moved together like parts of the same machine. The 4th was younger, maybe early 20s, and he handled the supplies and equipment with nervous hands that suggested he was not entirely comfortable with what was happening. Ji-Yeon memorized their faces and their habits. She noted which man carried which weapon, how they communicated, where they stored their gear. When the 2-hour head start ended and the brothers set out to track her, she watched which direction they went and how they searched. They were good, she had to admit, but she was better as darkness fell. Ji established a hidden base camp in a small cave she had discovered during her reconnaissance. Cave was barely large enough for one person, but it was dry and sheltered from the wind, and its entrance was concealed by fallen branches and thick brush. She would not make a fire tonight. Fire meant smoke, and smoke meant giving away her position to men who were actively hunting her instead. She wrapped herself in layers of pine needles and dead leaves, insulating her body against the cold with the same techniques she had taught to hundreds of students over the years. As she lay in the darkness, memories she had tried to bury began to surface. She thought about the mission in Afghanistan that had ended her military career. The night when everything had gone wrong and people had died because of decisions made above her pay grade. She had saved lives that night, pulling wounded soldiers to safety under fire, working with blood up to her elbows while bullets snapped past her head. But she had also taken lives, and that weight had never left her shoulders. She had promised herself afterward that she would never kill again. She had built a new life, teaching people how to survive without violence, how to work with nature instead of against it, how to find strength in knowledge rather than weapons. Now, 4 men were hunting her like an animal, and she had to decide what she was willing to do to stay alive. The answer came to her as the night grew deeper and colder. She would survive. She would stop these men from hurting anyone else, but she would do it her way, using every tool at her disposal except the one tool they expected her to use. The bullets in her revolver would be saved for when she had no other choice. Morning came gray and cold, and Ji-yeon began her work. She moved through the forest setting traps. Nothing lethal, but painful and disabling for anyone unlucky enough to trigger them. She used techniques older than civilization itself. Bent sapling held in place by a careful arrangement of sticks could deliver a stunning blow to anyone who disturbed the tripwire concealed. Pit lined with sharp branches could twist an ankle or break a leg. Loose rocks positioned above a narrow trail could create an avalanche that would stop any pursuer cold. By midday, she had created a network of surprises throughout the terrain surrounding her base camp. Then she climbed a tall pine tree and waited. The older of the 2 brothers found her first trap around 2 in the afternoon. She heard his scream from half a kilometer away, a high, sharp sound that echoed through the valley. The snare had caught his leg and yanked him upward, leaving him hanging upside down from a branch with his ankle twisted at an ugly angle. His brother found him 20 minutes later, and their radio conversation carried through the still mountain air. Ji-yeon crept close enough to hear Marcus respond, his voice tight with anger. "Get him back to the cabin," he ordered. "This changes nothing. She is still just one woman." Just one woman. The words made Ji-yeon smile, though there was no warmth in it, as the uninjured brother helped his sibling limp back toward the cabin. Ji-yeon followed them at a distance. She moved through the trees like a ghost, never making a sound, never revealing her position when they stopped to rest. She stopped when they moved. She moved by the time they reached the cabin. She had learned their radio frequency by listening to their conversations. She had also stolen a small supply pack that the injured brother had dropped without noticing. A pack that contained water purification tablets, energy bars, and most importantly, a handheld radio. That night, Ji-yeon crouched in her cave and listened to the voices of her hunters crackling through the stolen radio. Marcus was not happy. "She is smarter than I thought," he admitted to someone. "Probably the young logistics man, but that just makes her worth more. Double the prize for whoever brings her back breathing. Double the prize." So there was money involved. Rich clients who paid for the privilege of hunting human beings. The thought made Ji-yeon's stomach turn, but it also gave her valuable information. These men were not just killers. They were businessmen, and businessmen made decisions based on profit. If she could make hunting her more expensive than it was worth, she might be able to end this without anyone dying. The radio crackled again, and this time it was one of the brothers speaking. The storm system is moving faster than they predicted, he said. Weather Service says it could hit within 48 hours. Maybe less. A storm GN closed her eyes and felt something. That might have been hope bad weather would change. Everything that would limit visibility and make tracking nearly impossible. It would force her hunters to seek shelter instead of pursuing her, and if it was bad enough, it might trap everyone on this mountain together. Predator and prey alike, she would need to prepare more supplies, better shelter, and a plan for what to do when the snow started falling. But for the first time since she had woken up in that cabin with her hands bound, Ji-Yeon felt like she might actually survive this. She checked her revolver in the dim light that filtered through the cave entrance. 10 rounds. While still waiting in the cylinder, she had not fired a single shot. And if she was lucky, she never would. The knife was strapped to her thigh, and she had used it dozens of times, already cutting branches for traps, sharpening stakes, slicing strips of bark for rope. It was a tool, not a weapon, and that was how she intended to keep it. Tomorrow she would continue her work. Tomorrow she would show these men what happened when they underestimated a woman who had been trained by the best military in the world. Tomorrow the hunt would truly begin, but they would not be the ones doing the hunting. They left her with 10 rounds and a knife. It was their final mistake. The second day brought gray skies and the smell of coming snow. And Ji-Yeon woke before dawn with a clarity of purpose she had not felt in years. She was done hiding and done simply defending. It was time to take the fight to her hunters. The younger of the two brothers was easier to find than she expected. He was alone, moving through the forest with more confidence than skill, following a trail that Ji-Yeon had deliberately left the day before. She watched him from above, perched in the branches of an old pine tree with bark rough against her palms. He walked right beneath her, without ever looking up. People almost never looked up. She had taught that lesson to every survival class she had ever led, and now she used it against the man who wanted her dead. Ji-Yeon dropped down behind him, silent as falling snow. Before he could turn around, she had swept his legs out from under him and pressed the barrel of her revolver against the back of his head. "Do not move," she said quietly. "Do not make a sound." He froze, his whole body going rigid with fear. "Please," he whispered. "Please do not kill me." Ji-Yeon felt something twist in her chest at the terror in his voice. This was not who she wanted to be. This was not the person she had worked so hard to become. But she needed information, and fear was a faster teacher than trust. "How many clients have you hunted for?" she asked. The man swallowed hard before answering. 7, maybe 8. I lost count." "How many people have died?" A long pause, and then a number that made Ji-Yeon's blood run cold. 11. That we know of 11 people. 11 human beings hunted like animals in these mountains and killed for the entertainment of wealthy strangers. Ji-Yeon pressed the gun harder against his skull. "And you just helped? You just watched?" "I had no choice," the man said, his voice breaking. "Marcus, he knows things about me, about my family. If I tried to leave or go to the police, he would destroy everything. It could have been a lie, a desperate attempt to gain sympathy from someone holding his life in her hands." But Ji-Yeon had spent years learning to read people, and she heard something real in his voice, something broken. "What is your name?" she asked. "Daniel," he whispered. Daniel Chen. Ji-Yeon made a decision. She pulled the gun back from his head and stepped away. "Turn around slowly." Daniel obeyed, and she saw tears streaming down his face. He was young, younger than she had thought. Probably no more than 22 or 23. His hand shook as he held them up in surrender. "Here's what is going to happen," Ji-Yeon said. "I am going to tie you up and leave you with water. When this is over, someone will come for you. But you are going to answer some questions first. For the next 15 minutes. Daniel told her everything. He told her about the clients who paid, hundreds of thousands of dollars for the chance to hunt human prey. He told her about the bodies buried in unmarked graves throughout the mountain range. He told her about Marcus and his connections to organized crime, about the offshore accounts where the money was hidden, about the satellite phone that could reach anyone in the world, and he told her about the reinforcements that Marcus had already called. Men who would arrive by helicopter once the storm passed. Yeon listened to all of it with a face carved from stone when Daniel finished. She bound his hands and feet with strips of cloth torn from his own jacket, then left him propped against a tree with a bottle of water within reach of his fingers. "If you are telling the truth," she said, "then maybe you will get a second chance. But if I find out you lied to me about any of this, I will find you, and there will not be a third conversation." Daniel nodded frantically, and Ji-yeon disappeared into the forest without another word. The uninjured brother was next. She led him on a chase through terrain she had studied carefully the day before, always staying just out of sight, always leaving just enough trail for him to follow. He was a better tracker than his sibling, more cautious and more patient. But patience meant nothing when you were walking into a trap designed specifically for youth. Ravine was hidden by a layer of fallen leaves and loose brush. By the time the brother realized the ground was not solid beneath his feet, he was already falling. Ji-yeon heard the crack of his leg breaking from 50 meters away, followed by screams that echoed off the stone walls of the ravine. She did not go to help him. His radio would bring Marcus and the others, and she needed to be elsewhere when they arrived. The logistics man was her next target, but he surprised her when Jean reached the cabin. She found him already trying to flee. He had loaded supplies into a battered truck and was fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking so badly that he could barely fit them into the ignition. Ji-yeon raised her revolver and took careful aim. The shot was clean, punching through the engine block with a sound like a thunderclap. The truck shuddered and died, smoke pouring from beneath the hood. She stepped out of the tree line with the gun still raised, and the man behind the wheel began to cry. His name was Kevin, and he was even less of a threat than Daniel had been. He surrendered without resistance, babbling about how he never wanted any of this, how he was just a driver, how he would tell the police everything if they would just let him live. Ji-yeon tied him up beside the disabled truck and took his radio, his phone, and every scrap of useful equipment she could carry. 9 rounds left. She had used 1 bullet on a truck engine, and she felt something like relief, knowing it had not been aimed at a person. The pious in the wishes, and she felt something like relief that the duets. Sun was setting when she finally allowed herself to rest. She had neutralized 3 of the 4 men without taking a single life, and now only Marcus remained. But Marcus was the most dangerous of them all, and she knew he would not go down as easily as the others. Her radio crackled to life, and his voice filled the cold evening air. "I know you can hear me," he said. "I do not know how you did it, but you have made quite the mess of my operation." Jean did not respond. "The storm is coming," Marcus continued, "and when it passes, my friends will arrive with more guns and more men than you can possibly handle. So here is my offer. Come back to the cabin, and we will make this quick. No more games, no more hunting, just a clean ending." Still she said nothing. A long pause, and then Marcus laughed. It was an ugly sound, empty of any real amusement. "Or keep running, it does not matter. Nobody escapes these mountains, not in winter, not with what is coming." Ji-yeon turned off the radio and looked up at the sky. The clouds were thick and dark, pressing down on the world like a heavy blanket. Snow would start falling within hours. Maybe sooner. Marcus was right about one thing: the storm was coming, but he was wrong about everything else. Ji-yeon did not plan to run, she planned to survive. And when the storm passed and the helicopters came, she would be ready for them too. She checked her supplies one final time before heading back to her hidden cave. 9 rounds in her revolver, 1 knife that had never tasted, blood, and a mind full of plans for what would come. Next, the hunt was far from over, but for the first time, she was absolutely certain who would be standing when it ended. They left her with 10 rounds and a knife. It was their final mistake. The storm hit like the fist of an angry god. Ji-Yan had weathered bad storms before, had survived blizzards in the mountains of Korea and sandstorms in the deserts of Iraq. But this was something different. The wind screamed through the trees with enough force to snap branches as thick as her arm. And the snow fell so heavy that she could barely see her hand in front of her face. She had made it back to her cave just before the worst of it arrived. And now she huddled in the darkness, listening to the world tear itself apart outside. Her supplies were limited, but sufficient. She had water from melted snow, energy bars from Kevin's pack, and enough layers of insulation to keep her core temperature stable. She could survive here for days if necessary, but survival was no longer her only concern. Through the howling wind, she heard voices. At first she thought it was a trick of the storm, the way it could make sounds that seemed almost human. But then she heard it again. Clearer this time, someone was calling for help. Ji-Yan closed her eyes and tried to ignore it. Whoever was out there was one of the men who had wanted her dead. One of the hunters who had chased her through these mountains like she was nothing more than prey. They deserved whatever the storm gave them. But the voice kept calling, weaker now, and something inside Ji-Yan shifted. She had made a promise to herself years ago. A promise that she would never become the kind of person who could ignore suffering. No matter who was suffering, she had kept that promise through war and trauma and 1,000 dark nights of the soul. She was not going to break it. Now Ji-Yan gathered her gear and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and cutting through her layers like they were made of paper. She forced herself to move forward, following the sound of the voice through the blinding white. She found them 15 minutes later, huddled together beneath an outcrop of rock that provided almost no protection from the wind. The two brothers, one with a twisted ankle and one with a broken leg, clinging to each other as the storm tried to freeze them solid. They looked up at her with eyes full of fear and confusion. Here was the woman they had hunted, the prey that had turned the tables on them so completely, standing over them with a gun on her hip and a knife on her thigh. They expected death. What they got was a hand reaching down to help them up. "Can you walk?" Ji-Yan asked the older brother. He stared at her like she was speaking a foreign language. "Why?" was all he managed to say. "Because we need to move now or all 3 of us will die, and I am not ready to die today. So get up." She helped them to their feet, one on each side of her, their weight heavy on her shoulders. As they stumbled through the storm, the cave was barely visible, even knowing where to look. But Jean found it by memory and instinct. She guided the brothers inside and helped them sit against the stone wall, then went back out to gather more branches to block the entrance. When she returned, both men were shivering violently, their faces pale and their breathing shallow. Hypothermia was setting in. Ji-Yan worked quickly, stripping off their wet outer layers and packing dry leaves around their bodies for insulation. Her medic training took over, and she checked their pulses and pupils with practiced efficiency. "You are going to live," she said, "but only if you do exactly what I tell you." The brothers exchanged a look that Ji-Yan could not quite read. "Why are you helping us?" the younger one finally asked. "We were going to kill you." Ji-Yan sat back on her heels and considered the question. "Because I am not like you," she said simply. "I do not leave people to die, not even people who wanted me dead." Hours passed. The storm raged outside while Ji-Yan tended to her unlikely patients. She set the younger brother's leg as best she could, using branches as splints and strips of cloth as bandages. And she treated the older brother's infected ankle wound with antiseptic from Kevin's stolen kid as they recovered. They talked. Their names were Thomas and Michael, and they had grown up in a small town in Idaho where jobs were scarce and opportunities were Scarce Marcus had found them 10 years ago, offered them money to work as guides and trackers for his hunting business by the time they realized what they were really tracking. It was too late to walk away. He has files on everyone, Thomas said, his voice hollow. Photos, recordings, evidence of things we did before we even knew what we were getting into. If we tried to leave or talk to anyone, he would make sure we spent the rest of our lives in prison. Ji Yan listened without judgment. She had seen enough of the world to know that evil rarely announced itself with fanfare. It crept in slowly, one small compromise at a time, until you found yourself standing in a place you never thought you would be. How many people? She asked. How many total? Thomas closed his eyes. Too many. There were the Hunts, 11 people that we know of. But there were others too. People who stumbled onto the operation by accident and had to be dealt with. The number hit Ji Yan like a punch to the gut. She had known these men were killers, but hearing the full scope of their crimes made it real in a way that observation alone never could. The clients, Michael added. Some of them are powerful people, politicians and executives, and people who could destroy anyone who tried to expose them. That is why nobody has ever talked. That is why this has gone on for so long. Ji Yan thought about all those victims, all those families who never knew what happened to their loved ones. She thought about the graves hidden somewhere in these mountains, unmarked and forgotten, and she thought about what would happen when the storm ended and the reinforcements arrived. There is a helicopter coming, she said. Marcus called for help before the storm hit. Thomas nodded grimly. Victor Reese and his people. They are the money behind all of this. If they are coming, then they plan to clean house. No witnesses, no evidence, nothing that can be traced back to them. Then we need to be ready for them. The brothers stared at her with something that might have been respect or might have been fear. You have a plan? Michael Eskejian looked out at the storm still howling beyond the cave entrance. I have the beginning of one, but I will need your help before they could respond. The radio on Jian's belt crackled to life. Hello? Is anyone there? It was Marcus. His voice sounded strange, weaker than before, and there was a desperate edge to it that had not been there earlier. I am stuck, he continued. The storm caught me in the open, and I cannot feel my legs anymore. If anyone can hear this, please help. Thomas and Michael both turned to look at Ji Yunt. Question was clear in their eyes, even though neither of them spoke it out loud. Would she save the man who had started all of this? The man who had hunted innocent people for sport and profit for 5 long years? Ji Yan stood up and checked her gear. Where would he be? She asked. The North Ridge, probably, Thomas said. He has a favorite spot up there where he likes to watch the hunts. Ji headed for the cave entrance. Wait, Michael called out. You cannot seriously be going after him. Not in this. She paused and looked back over her shoulder. I told you, she said. I am not like him. That is the whole point. That is what makes me different. And then she stepped out into the storm. Once more she found Marcus 45 minutes later. Half buried in snow and barely conscious, he did not recognize her at first. Just grabbed at her hand like a drowning man reaching for anything that might keep him afloat. Help me, he whispered. Please help me. Ji Yan pulled him free of the snow and draped his arm over her shoulders. I am going to regret this, she muttered, and began the long trudge back to the cave. When they arrived, Thomas and Michael both went pale at the sight of their leader. Marcus was awake now, and his eyes darted between his men and the woman who had saved his life. You, he said, his voice hoarse. Why? Ji Yan let him drop onto the cave floor without ceremony. Because someone has to be the one who stops the cycle, she said. Someone has to be the one who chooses differently. And tonight that someone is me. She turned away before he could respond outside. The storm was finally beginning to weaken. Tomorrow, the sky would clear. Tomorrow, the helicopters would come, and tomorrow, everything would be decided. They left her with 10 rounds and a knife. It was their final mistake. The morning came cold and silent. The storm having passed some time in the hours before dawn, Ji-Yeon stepped out of the cave and looked up at a sky so blue it almost hurt to see it. Mountains stretched out before her covered in fresh snow. Beautiful and deadly in equal measure, she had maybe 2 hours before the helicopters arrived. 2 hours to prepare for whatever came next. Behind her, Marcus sat against the cave wall with his hands bound in front of him. He had not spoken since she saved his life. Just stared at her with an expression she could not quite read. Thomas and Michael were already on their feet, their injuries bandaged but not healed. Their loyalty shifted by the long night they had spent watching Ji-Yeon choose mercy over revenge. "They will kill all of us," Marcus finally said. "Victor does not leave loose ends, not ever." Ji-Yeon checked her revolver one more time. 9 rounds. "Same as before. Then we make sure he does not get the chance." The plan was simple, because simple plans were the ones most likely to survive contact with reality. Daniel and Kevin were still tied up near the cabin, but Ji-Yeon had left them with enough slack to work themselves free once the storm passed. They would be wild cards, either helping or running depending on their courage. Thomas and Michael would position themselves at the edge of the clearing where the helicopters would likely land. Ji-Yeon would handle the rest. She spent the next hour working on the disabled truck, salvaging parts and wiring that she wove together with materials from her survival kit. By the time she finished, she had a crude but functional emergency beacon broadcasting on every frequency used by search and rescue operations in the region. Someone would hear it, someone would come. The only question was whether they would arrive before Victor Reese and his men finished cleaning up. The sound of rotors reached her ears just before noon. 2 helicopters approaching from the east. They circled the cabin once before touching down in the clearing, and Ji-Yeon watched from her hidden position as doors opened and men poured out. 6 of them, all armed with automatic weapons and the cold professional demeanor of people who killed for money. Victor Reese himself was the last to step onto the snow. He was older than Ji-Yeon expected, silver-haired and distinguished, the kind of man who probably sat on charity boards and attended gallery openings when he was not funding murder operations in the wilderness. "Marcus," he called out, "where are you? We need to talk about this mess you have created." Silence answered him. Victor frowned and gestured to his men, who spread out in a tactical formation and began moving toward the cabin. That was when Ji-Yeon made her first move. The shot was perfect, punching through the engine housing of the nearest helicopter with a sharp crack that echoed off the mountains. Oil began to pour onto the snow, and the pilot inside scrambled out with his hands raised. 8 rounds left. Victor spun toward the sound, his face twisting with anger. "Find her," he shouted. "Find her now." But finding her was not going to be easy. Ji-Yeon moved through the forest like a ghost, using every trick she knew to stay ahead of men who were trained, but not wilderness trained. Dangerous but not desperate, she fired again, this time into the radio equipment on the second helicopter. 7 rounds. Communications were down, which meant Victor could not call for additional support now. It was just a matter of time. The brothers emerged from hiding as planned, drawing 2 of Victor's men away from the main group with shouts and movement that made it seem like they were trying to flee. Reality, they were leading those men straight into the trap network Ji-Yeon had built over the past 3 days. Screams followed shortly after. 2 more enemies neutralized without killing them. Ji-Yeon kept moving, kept firing, always aiming for equipment and vehicles rather than bodies. 6 rounds after she disabled a snowmobile. 5 after she shot the weapon out of a guard's hands. Each shot was calculated, precise, designed to create chaos and fear without creating corpses. Victor's men began to panic. They had expected to sweep in and eliminate a handful of witnesses, not to face a coordinated resistance from an enemy who seemed to be everywhere at once. One by one they fell to traps or fled into the wilderness or simply dropped their weapons and surrendered. By the time Daniel and Kevin emerged from the cabin with their hands raised and their faces pale, it was already over. Victor Reese stood alone in the clearing, surrounded by his defeated men and the people he had come to kill. He still held a pistol, but his hand was shaking and his eyes darted from face to face like a trapped animal, looking for an escape that did not exist. Yeon walked out of the tree line and stopped 10 feet away from him. "Drop the gun," she said. Victor laughed, but it was a hollow sound without any real humor in it. "Do you know who I am? Do you have any idea what I can do to you? You are a man who pays other people to hunt human beings for sport, and what you can do to me is exactly nothing." She raised her revolver and pointed it at his chest. "I have 5 bullets left, and I have not used a single one on a person this entire time. So right now you need to ask yourself whether you want to be the first." The seconds stretched out like hours. Victor's face cycled through anger and fear and calculation before finally settling on something like defeat. The pistol dropped from his fingers and disappeared into the snow. "Good choice." Ji-yeon said. The rescue helicopters arrived 20 minutes later. Drawn by the emergency beacon Ji-yeon had activated, they brought federal agents and state police and medics who took one look at the scene and immediately called for backup. In the hours that followed, the full scope of Victor Reese's operation was exposed. The bodies buried in the mountains were found and identified. The client list was recovered from encrypted files on Victor's personal devices. Names that appeared in newspapers and on television were suddenly linked to murder and corruption on a scale that shocked even the most cynical investigators. Marcus Hawley was arrested, along with Victor and his surviving men Thomas and Michael. Cut deals with prosecutors in exchange for their testimony. Daniel Chun received a suspended sentence and mandatory counseling. His cooperation and coercion taken into account. Kevin, the driver, disappeared into witness protection and was never heard from again. Yeon spent 3 weeks answering questions from law enforcement before finally being allowed to go home. The story made national news, though the details were simplified and dramatized in ways that made her uncomfortable. Reporters called her a hero, a survivor, a symbol of human resilience. She did not feel like any of those things. She just felt tired. 6 months later, Ji-yeon stood in front of a new class of survival students. They were young and eager, full of questions about gear and techniques, and whether the stories they had heard about her were true. "The most important survival tool," she said when they finally settled down, "is not a knife or a gun or a fire starter. It is this." She tapped her temple. "Your mind is what keeps you alive, knowing when to fight and when to hide, when to push forward and when to wait, and most importantly, knowing who you are when everything else is stripped away." A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "Is it true you never killed anyone? Even the men who hunted you?" Ji-yeon thought about the question for a long moment before answering. "I had 10 rounds and a knife, and they thought those were weapons of desperation. But I used the bullets to disable equipment and the knife to build shelters and set traps. The real weapon was refusing to become what they expected me to be." She reached down and touched the knife on her belt, the same one Marcus had given her that first morning. She still carried it everywhere, not because she needed it, but because it reminded her of something important. "They made a mistake when they let me go," she said. "They assumed I was prey because I was a woman alone in the wilderness. They thought 10 rounds and a knife was all I had. But what I actually had was 8 years of military training, a lifetime of survival knowledge, and the absolute certainty that I would not let them win." The students were silent, hanging on her every word. "That certainty," Ji-yeon continued, "that refusal to quit no matter how bad things got, That is what survival really means. It is not about being the strongest or the fastest or the best equipped. It is about being the one who keeps going when everyone else has given up. She smiled. And for the first time in months, it felt genuine. Now, who wants to learn how to build a fire without matches? The class erupted in eager hands, and Ji-yeon began to teach outside. The mountains stood tall against a clear blue sky, ancient and patient and full of secrets somewhere out there. 11 graves had finally been found, and 11 families had finally received closure, and some were in a federal prison. A man named Marcus Halle was remembering the woman he had called a lost little tourist. The woman who had taken his 10 rounds and his knife, and used them to bring down an empire of death. His final mistake was thinking she was prey. The truth was she had always been the most dangerous thing in those mountains. She just chose not to prove it with violence, and that choice made all the difference.